All right, so Mitch Stokes wants us to take science seriously. He said Hume inherited Newton's restraint regarding unobservable causes. He realized, however, that when it came to gravity, the problem was even worse than simply divining some hidden cause of the gravity. We can't even observe the forces themselves, right? Hume believed we only observe and feel the effects of these alleged forces, not the actual forces.
Right. So we know that we weigh 1/6 our weight on the moon as we do on Earth, but that's just a mathematical equation that gives us a relationship between two bodies. We don't. There's no kind of measurement for, here's the kind of gravity particles that we see are pulling us down in some fashion. It's not like a magnet where we see the flakes of iron going around the magnet, and even then we don't really see. We just see the effects of whatever that field takes. Yeah. So Hume believed that we observe and feel the effects of these alleged forces, but not the actual forces, like you were saying. But when we talk about gravity, we mean certain effects. We don't actually mean that this kind of a voodoo explanation of, you experience this because of the waves of the ether washing over you and pulling you back towards the surface.
Right. So these were Aristotle's explanations, right? His essences, his natures, his occult powers, right?
The humors.
Yeah. And so we have to reinterpret words like force, power, and energy if they are to have, legitimate meaning. That is, reinterpret them from the way Aristotle did. They're not, according to the new physics with Galileo and then Newton, they weren't occult powers, essences, and natures, right? So Hume was, so this was a problem, though, because we can't, again, see these causes.
Because that's all we're given. We're given just our sense perception. We have to remember that. That's all we're able to appropriate here.
Yeah, and so he says, so then Hume was painfully aware of the epistemological problems associated with unobserved causes. He says we shouldn't ask too much of natural philosophy. We should be cautious, circumspect, and skeptical. That's the natural, general, skeptical response that we should have, right? Right? And so Hume believes then that whenever laws seem to refer to forces or gravity or anything else that we don't observe, we should think of them not as referring to actual causes or powers, but simply, as a way to keep track of the appearances. Right. This is the way that it appears to us.
This is what it looks like.
Yeah. So Hume's aim then, the science cannot be revealed the intellectual character of the universe, but simply to catalog the regularities that causal sequences reflect, right? So we catalog these things, and we do that with math, basically, right?
Right. So we have F equals ma as Newton would allow us to have until Einstein came around. So we were able to, the force, that Aristotelian word force is mass times acceleration, and so whatever force now means is just, this is the push or pull on something that an object traveling at such and such acceleration with such and such weight.
Right. And this is the mathematical way to describe that.
Right. But there's no internal force. So there's nothing that tells us that the object moves in this way because it desires to, or whatever it might be.
This is just we catalog the regularities. This is what it does.
Right. And so with falsification models of these explanations, why does this occur? Because this, and if you have again so many different flaws in that theory, then it upends it. And is science wrong? Would we say, Newton had the best science of the day, and it turned out to be incorrect, and so clearly science is lost. We're done. We believe that it was science, and so
our trust.
And so when we say today science, it's this big capital S, godlike science of science tells us this. Well, no, what science does is it catalogs in limit these observations that we kind of say here seems to be some regularity to it, and then once we get into induction and morality, things kind of even go more out the window. But at least with science, it only tells us these things happen, and it seems like you can match up a mathematical equation with a regularity if it occurs.
Right. And so he says all explanatory theories must consist in what Hume's called obscure and uncertain speculations, hypotheses or hypotheses in the pejorative sense that Hume sometimes shared with Newton, and which they both had problems with. Hypotheses, he tells us, and here's his point, whether in the pejorative sense or not, are unobserved explanations. That's what a hypothesis is, an unobserved explanation. And he tells us, and he wants to emphasize this because he wants us to understand this, he says, I cannot overemphasize this. We'll look at this in more detail later, but the distinction between what we observe and what we infer from these observations is crucial, right? Otherwise, all matter of folly ensues. So there's a distinction between observing something and then our inference, right, from the things that we observe. There is a distinction there, and he wants us to be clear that we maintain that distinction, right? We observed the billiard ball hitting, and we observed the clicking sound, right? And then we infer somehow that caused the next billiard ball to move, right? We don't observe that. We observe the next billiard ball moving, but we don't observe the causality of it, right? We observe the movement, the click, and then we observe the next ball moving. We don't observe causality. We infer causality.
So if we think about it as, we tend to think of the force is moving through it, which sounds metaphysical. Skywalker would do it. The force flows through us, and so the force flows from the stick to the cue ball, and that transfers into it. But we don't actually see that happening. So how do we measure that? It only seems like what we do is, again, we infer that somehow the force transfers from the cue ball to the 8-ball, and then that's what propels it forward. But we don't actually physically, naturalistically, with our senses, see. We hear it, but we don't see it to say this is what caused the 8-ball to move because of the interaction, if any.
And so he calls this epistemological restraint, this making this distinction and being skeptical about our inferences, right? He says this epistemological restraint, however, quickly diminished the credentials of our cognitive faculties. The limits of a sense experience undermine common sense, threatening to take science with it. We do not see that there is an external world. We do not see that reason is reliable, and that the cue ball causes the 8-ball to move. And even if we ignore these skeptical results, science, according to Hume, is still limited to merely cataloging and describing what we can directly observe. The success of science, for example, the ability of Newton's theories, laws of gravity and that sort of thing, ironically led to skepticism about gravity itself, leaving only the husk of its effects. For Hume, things came full circle like the snake eating its tail, right? So because we only make these observations, we can't, that's as far as we can go. We don't directly observe these other types of things. So we're limited, science is limited in what it can do for us, right? And so, thinking about the last chapter where science now explains everything, Hume says, wait just a minute. Right?
Yeah.
That's going too far.
A lot too far.
Yeah. So he says, my point here is that Hume valiantly tried to take science and skepticism seriously, attempting to follow reason wherever it led. His most successful moments were almost his most despondent.
Right, because he's using reason which he can't observe, and he's trying to be careful, but at the same time he's also using a system that it essentially fails upon the first step.
Yeah. So for Hume then, science led to skepticism, which in turn led to weariness about the reach of science, or wariness about the reach of science. This taking science and skepticism, it's taking it pretty seriously. Right?
Yeah. So we should look to Hume because he seems to be at least trying to be that sober skeptic.
That's right. He's trying to be consistent in his skepticism. Right?
So postulating multi-universes, and that just physical physics seems to bring about life. Those seems to be.
And these are all of these things, multi-universe, we do not observe.
Right.
And so Hume would say, well, what are you doing? Right? That's not science.
Yeah.
Right?
It's almost like if you have an offshoot of, let's say, like Christianity, who says, oh, well, if you don't engage in multiple wives, you're damned to hell. Well, that seems to be overreaching what they claim that the source, the originator of that maybe religion tends to be. Yeah. I'm not saying it's a perfect one-to-one parallel, but it's what I observe.
Right. So science leads to skepticism because all we have is what we can observe, and our observations don't observe things like multiple universes, right? That kind of stuff. So.
Boy, science seems like it's heading down the wrong track. We might have to give up science and turn towards something else.
So he wants us to be sober skeptics, and when we do that, science may not take us as far as we would like for it to take us, right?